I wanted to introduce our panellists for the session this afternoon. We've got four amazing panellists here. What I'm going to do is open the session very briefly with a couple of comments that may or may not be accompanied by one or two slides. Do you have to press it really hard? Yeah. Yeah, okay. So, all right. Somebody will help. I'll very briefly open the session with a couple of comments around the topic of sustainable and ethical procurement and provide some definitions and very high-level context for that. But the bulk of the session, which will run until 4 o'clock or so, will really be with our four amazing panellists. We've got Nicole Sullivan from the Green Business Council of Australia, Ross Davies, the Sustainability Manager for BlueScope Steel, who has threatened that it will be impossible to moderate him, so we'll find out. We've got Jackie Aggett, the Head of Procurement, Australian Hub from Laing O'Rourke, and we've got Richard Brincat, the Organisational Development Partner from Transport for New South Wales. And we still don't have any slides. So I'm going to just pretend you can see a diagram here that's showing you the difference between ethical procurement and social procurement. My company, the Australian Centre for Corporate Social Responsibility, or ACCSR, had the pleasure of working with ISCA earlier this year on a piece of work to define and benchmark best practices in ethical and social procurement. And so it's on that basis that I'm able to speak to you briefly about that today. The full paper will be distributed in the delegate materials after the conference. But what I wanted to talk about initially was what is the difference between ethical and social procurement. They're both different aspects of sustainable procurement, and briefly state the business case for doing this. I was very encouraged, actually, that in the presentations that we've seen so far today, there's been some great examples of social procurement in particular. And I really liked the example that came through earlier this morning from the California High-Speed Rail project, where the speaker mentioned that 94 businesses from disadvantaged communities had been brought on as suppliers to this massive infrastructure project, which is a marvellous example of what I would call social procurement. The business case for sustainable procurement of any type, whether you think it's ethical or sustainable or social, and I bet you those slides aren't even actually there, is really a double-sided coin. One is about risk management and the other is about opportunity creation or value creation. We're getting a lot of support from government guidelines and regulations in this particular case. For example, the government has published, the federal government has published a suite of procurement-connected policies with the specific aim of driving better socio-economic outcomes through procurement. And that includes documents like the Commonwealth Procurement Rules, Indigenous Procurement Policy, Workplace Gender Equality Procurement Principles and User Guide, and the Australian Industry Participation Plan. Quite a few different state governments are also putting in place regulation and similar policy instruments. So things like the Victorian Industry Participation Plan and the New South Wales Aboriginal Participation in Construction Guidelines are great examples. But beyond compliance with these new guidelines, there are strong opportunities to better manage risks in the supply chain. And that's really what we would call ethical procurement, where as we see supply chains becoming larger, more extended, more global and more complex, the opportunity for problems to arise in the supply chain, whether they be of the social kind or the environmental kind, is increasingly there. So whether those problems relate to environmental impacts of suppliers' activities down the supply chain, or whether it relates to social impacts or human rights impacts down the supply chain, are workers being paid a fair living wage? Are they free from coercion? Is the supply chain free of bribery and corruption, for example? Those would be examples of ethical procurement risks in the supply chain. And the business case for that, I would think, would be very self-evident and very strong. It's just simply prudent risk management. Social procurement, though, responds perhaps even more substantially to changing societal expectations of big companies and big infrastructures projects, that they should be delivering social value as well as economic value. And social procurement is really a deliberate choice by organisations to generate social value through the inclusion of wider social objectives in their purchasing and procurement processes. So that might be the inclusion of Indigenous business. It might be providing opportunities for social enterprises or businesses from disadvantaged communities. It might be providing apprenticeships and traineeships to disadvantaged groups to build skills in the community. And in the most recent presentation from the Auckland railway project, we saw a good example of intention there. So they're examples of things that infrastructure developers can do on the social procurement side. On the ethical procurement side, it's about that risk management piece and things that you can do, including integrating ethical standards and sustainability into your procurement planning right from the outset, during due diligence to examine the supply chain as far back as you can go, ideally back to ground zero, to identify any negative impacts in your supply chain and really understanding those inherent risks. So this is the topic that we're looking at this afternoon. We've got four fabulous panellists here and four opportunities essentially to explore what these topics mean from the perspective of those organisations and their representatives here. So I'll start off asking the first question from here, but then I'm going to sit down and run the rest of the panel from here, because basically you've heard 99% of everything you're going to hear from me already, so no need to stand up. But I want to ask first each one of the organisations up here to tell us a little bit about your organisation, very briefly, but particularly to focus on some of the biggest social, ethical or environmental procurement challenges that you are facing right now in your projects and what you see the opportunities to be. Have I got a volunteer? We're going to start at one end and work down to the other. So, Richard, let's kick it off with you.
Yeah, I guess from where I stand, it's very much from a skills perspective. Transport for New South Wales has a number of projects on the go, and there is significant record investment in infrastructure build at the moment. So that's putting real pressure on a skilled workforce. So for us as an entity, we're really struggling to see and procure those skilled workers to meet the project demands. And we're hitting a bit of a bubble in terms of a number of projects overlapping, and I'm sure a number of you in the audience are probably coming across that as well.
So skilled workers is the big challenge there. Do these work? Some of them.
Mine does.
Yours does. Okay. Do any of the others work? Oh, yeah, they do. They do. Thank you for that, Richard. So finding skilled workers, the top challenge there. And Jackie, what about your work as Head of Procurement at Laing O'Rourke?
Okay. Is mine working? Yep. I suppose just to put it in context, we would spend about $2 billion per annum with the supply chain. And in procurement, which I head up, we have a team of about 40 procurement professionals across Australia that are allocated to the projects that we work on. For me, when I look at ethical and environmental and social, for me, our environmental really is embedded in our operations. For me, there's no challenges except for that we adhere, we monitor, we report, we embrace and we challenge. For me, the biggest challenge really is social procurement and what that means. And I think for us, when we're bidding and our clients are starting to ask the question, it's about understanding that if we embrace that and make it a commitment, which we're doing, then how do we demonstrate that it's not just words on a paper? So when we receive a bid, we usually have about a 6-week period to determine our procurement strategy during that time. And I think the challenge for me is demonstrating to our clients that we're serious about it, that we've got dedicated resources, and that we make it a very high priority in our whole bid strategy. and then ensuring that when we make that commitment during that bid phase, that the clients are evaluating that. And my challenge is, how are they evaluating that? What sort of weight evaluation matrix are they putting against that? And how do you determine those, my competitors, that are just putting words on paper as opposed to an organisation that's embracing, implementing policies and procedures that are really going to make a difference? So for me, that's one of the biggest challenges. The other is about ensuring the supply chain are capable and that they're ready to actually commence work on our projects. And that's a challenge about stakeholder mapping the supply chain, understanding who's out there, because it's a change in the way we do business, because we've really predominantly looked at creating value for money, as opposed to now looking at value for our stakeholders, and understanding who's out there and who's capable, and at what tier should they be engaging on the project.
That's a big order of challenges that you've got there, and but very clearly articulated. Thank you, Jackie. Ross, what about you?
Well, for me, there's really two areas here. I think one's from steel supply, or the steel supply chain, where the issue is that we're often just a component in the finished product that ends up in the building or infrastructure or whatever it might be. So it's really there, the challenge is ensuring that the sustainability principles are followed through from where we might be delivering them into that finished product. So how it's used, how people appreciate the use of that and get the greatest value sustainably out of the appropriate use of that steel product. So that's one component. I think the other component is really more in our raw material supply. And we're reasonably lucky, being an Australian manufacturer, that our major suppliers, the materiality of our major suppliers, are all also well down the sustainability path, whether it's BHP Billiton or one of the other major metal suppliers and mineral suppliers. But there's always issues around the details of your supply chain, and I guess I can talk about this later, but ensuring that ethical labour rights and practices are consistent throughout that supply chain. So we've been applying some questionnaires and checking processes, very similar to Laing O'Rourke and others, through our supply chain, but we're really still on that journey. So we've done it with our major, 80%, but the issue is we need to get to the bulk of all the smaller suppliers in our supply chain as well.
Well, getting to the first 80% is a great achievement. Thank you, Ross. And Nicole, tell us what's happening at the Green Business Council.
So I'm fairly new at the Green Building Council, and really I've been involved with Green Star for a long time. And what's interesting for us at the moment is we're just on the cusp of releasing a new strategic plan next month. And we're really starting to look out to our next major version of Green Star. And for us, with ISCA, we really are charged with the responsibility of setting the bar for the industry and working with industry on working out where we need to set that bar, and creating commercial drivers to do it. We're very aware that as we actually put these challenges in place in the terms of our credits, that what that does is it provides commercial incentives for suppliers and for developers alike to really lift into doing more and better. But at the same time, we don't want it to be an administrative nightmare. When you lift the bar, you want it to be because you're setting environmental and social challenges, not, how good is your model of greenhouse gases. So for us, it's trying to strike the balance and get the bar in the right spot.
Okay, so 4 different but connected challenges there in terms of ethical and social procurement. Can we just take this a tad deeper with another round of questions? And Richard, starting again with you, Transport for New South Wales is developing its social procurement workforce policy. Can you tell us what is a social procurement workforce policy? Tell us about your approach and what kinds of social outcomes you're aiming for through the procurement channel.
Yep. The policy looks to not only meet current legislated requirements. In New South Wales, there is a requirement to develop capabilities for Aboriginal participation in the construction workforce, as well as the numbers of apprentices and trainees allocated to key projects. What we're looking at from a transport perspective is a bit more of a holistic approach. It's looking at opportunities where certain projects run through certain regions, and it's looking at the workforce demographics, not only the population makeup, but the skills of that population as well, and opportunities to provide development to allow a workforce that can then be developed around that particular project. With a view to expand the construction workforce. It's been in contraction to a large extent in a number of key trades. What we're trying to do is incent organisations to look at the traditional pipelines, or where they particularly pull people into the construction industry. So it's looking at Indigenous areas, it's looking at refugees that are coming into the country with little to no skills, it's looking at upskilling existing workers, it's looking at improving female representation in the construction workforce. So the policy is looking at a fair and equitable way where we can engage with industry early on in the process. The intent is through the procurement process we do a fairly bit detailed analysis of the actual opportunity and sit down and partner with the contractors around what does the likelihood of the workforce makeup look like, what does that skills plan look like, and what is the opportunity for our contractors to innovate and provide solutions in that space.
Okay, so thank you for that. There's really focusing on Indigenous participation, various minorities, refugees. What are the outcomes that you're looking for from that policy?
What we're looking for in terms of outcomes are sustainable jobs and a career to be established within the industry as well, to really plug that gap where we're seeing drop-offs in certain trade areas in particular.
Address the skills gap.
Yeah.
Excellent. It's a great goal for a social procurement policy. Can we just mix it up a little bit here and perhaps jump to Ross? In addition to your day-to-day role as the sustainability manager at BlueScope Steel, you've also developed a great passion in recent years for a project called the Responsible Steel Program. Can you tell us what is that all about? Why do we need a Responsible Steel Program, and what are some of the benefits that you see from embedding sustainability into the full steel supply chain?
We've about 4 or 5 years ago now, we decided as a steel industry that we needed to look at what could be done around the sustainability of the entire supply chain for steel. And out of that came a project called Responsible Steel, which is still under development. We piloted much of the work here in Australia, but it will now be a global scheme. And in fact, just last week we had a meeting of the Global Council here in Australia. So I think, Leeora, you already highlighted a number of some of the issues that have been raised about why we need a scheme like this, and those were the risk ones around the issues on a global sense around supply chain. So whether it's human rights, labour rights, governance, or any of those environmental issues, you've only got to think of companies like 7-Eleven or Sumaco, any of the footwear or clothing industries in recent years. It only takes one tweet, an Instagram or something else, and suddenly your corporate reputation is completely destroyed. Now that's on the risk side, but on the positive side, we should be rewarding those companies that are doing the right thing. We should be giving some benefit in terms of procurement to the companies that are looking after their people, that are doing the right thing by the environment, and many are. And in addition to that, we need to bring those that are prepared to come along that journey to improve themselves through that process. So particularly in the developing countries, we need to move some of those things further forward quicker. So there's a whole lot of things there. In the end, the procurement side of it, need to be confident and have confidence in the supply chain that there's really nothing bad happening in the supply chain. You don't need to know too much more than that, but if there's nothing bad happening in my supply chain, I'm generally pretty happy. So that's easier said than done, I guess. But, there's schemes already around. The forest stewardship scheme's been around for 25 years. There's marine stewardship, there's beef, there's sugar, there's tea. There's a number of these schemes, but there's very little or nothing in the metals industry. So we're creating a scheme that will create a standard for steel, much like FSC, from mining right through to recycling. So the entire steel supply chain, and it's designed to fit not only OECD countries, but developing countries as well. I think the other bit you asked me just briefly was why the full supply chain and what advantage from the full supply chain? Well, the hotspot issues, if you want to call them that, around global supply chains can hit in a whole range of areas. And in steel, it might be areas, for example, like biodiversity and land use in mining. It's carbon issues. We're a high carbon product, and so you have to understand what are we doing and how are we trying to minimise that in steel making. It could be labour rights in international scrap handling. It could be governance in some jurisdictions, or environmental or emissions issues in other jurisdictions. There's differences between geographies and developed and developing countries that are really significant. So in that way, you then have to address that full supply chain and the full scope, a holistic approach to things.
Thank you. The need for certification and credits and so forth clearly is very helpful in driving higher standards. And Nicole, you mentioned earlier that the Green Building Council of Australia, one of the benefits of this scheme is that it provides commercial incentives for suppliers. But earlier in the break, you mentioned to me that social sustainability is really a rising focus here. Can you tell us a little bit more about the rise of concepts of social sustainability at the GBCA and how that ties into the whole idea of commercial incentives? Hopefully it does.
Sure. Yeah. Social sustainability is a really interesting topic. If you look at sustainable procurement, Jackie was saying, I wouldn't say we've got the environmental side nailed, but we're certainly a lot further ahead in that area, and economics kind of takes care of itself. But the social sustainability side is really a challenge. And as I speak with our members, it's really interesting to hear what definitions of social sustainability come out. So the first place that people jump is, social sustainability is about these buildings that we build and make better places for work and for living, great communities, great places to be, healthy buildings and all that sort of stuff. And before I continue, don't hear me say that is bad. That is a good thing and I like it. But I wonder if that marries with the term sustainability. What is sustainability? Sustainability is about equity. It's about the needs of the present and the needs of the future. It's about maintaining equality, and not just in the first world, but in that supply chain that we've heard about just now. And so I think that's a real challenge for us to grapple with as the Green Building Council and at ISCA as well, I'm sure, that we actually need to work out what social sustainability is, what social procurement looks like, and how we incentivise that in our tools. I mentioned commercial incentives earlier because we found that in the supply chain, when we put even an innovation challenge out for something, all of a sudden all these people go scurrying behind closed doors to create things that meet that challenge. And there was one innovation challenge that we actually put on the table fairly recently in a small group and said, look, we're not really seeing uptake of this one. Perhaps we should be pulling it off. Now, you might be horrified to know that was social return on investment. And we went, we're not really seeing take-up of that. And everyone went, no. Everyone's just working out how to do it, but we're on the way. Don't take it away. And what happens is that when we put something up, we actually have to give the market time to respond. But the market does respond because there is commercial incentive to being able to say, I can get a credit for doing this work.
Okay. Jackie, you laid out a number of very significant challenges in embedding sustainability considerations into the supply chain. You talked about getting it into your bid strategy, getting your clients up to speed and on board with this, ensuring the supply chain is ready, being able to map the supply chain to down deep to various tiers and levels. Which are all significant challenges, and we could speak more about those. But what I wanted to ask you now is about the particular challenge of implementing sustainable procurement practices into existing procurement policies and programs as against the new and emerging ones. How do you retrofit?
Okay, and I suppose the biggest challenge in that aspect is you've got a function and professionals that have been judged and rewarded on competitively bidding and awarding to often the lowest bidder, creating value for money. That is the industry in construction. Margins are tight and we're going in and being very competitive. So the biggest challenge is changing a culture that has been rewarded for negotiating and awarding, and it's also about awarding to a supply chain that can demonstrate they've delivered previously and they have the experience. So to overlap a policy that says you now need to start looking at minority groups, at Indigenous businesses, at female disability, is in conflict with that. So the first thing we've done is the board have approved an Indigenous policy for Laing. It stands alone and it's a policy that we have within our business. Obviously, when we're working on a project and we have our client mandated Indigenous targets, they will override. But it's about changing a culture so that any procurement team or our project delivery teams, that will be business as usual. So we will go onto a project and we will look and determine that 1.5% of all spend will be directed through Indigenous businesses. And we're looking at rolling that out across more the social, so looking at local participation. So we often have a local participation guidelines. So we're doing it by introducing policies. We're doing it by educating and communicating the benefits to the projects and the delivery teams. We're doing it by introducing steps in our procurement processes, such as holding industry briefings to ensure that the local participation and the local businesses know about the project. They know how to register their interests. We're looking at developing some mentoring programs for SME businesses so that they understand our terms and conditions, they understand about completing the questionnaires and about our due diligence process. So by introducing these steps, it is becoming easier and you can feel the culture is starting to respond. We also have, as well as the industry briefings, what we're doing is then making it public about who we've awarded the contracts to. So the smaller businesses or minority groups can then go and target the correct businesses. So it might be that your business isn't in a position to contract directly with Laing, but certainly what we'll do is introduce you to the right level in the supply chain and make that transparent to the business.
That's fantastic. That's real leadership.
Yeah.
That's terrific. We've only got a few more minutes on this panel, and there's so many different ideas that have popped up from each one of our speakers. We could go on all day, but I'll just take the opportunity to ask one more question of everybody on the panel, and that's about outcomes. What are the beneficial outcomes, whether it is in the area of risk management or environment or community or human rights, but what are the beneficial outcomes that you have already seen as a result of initiating sustainable procurement policies and procedures? Did you want to kick that one off, Richard?
I can talk to probably a couple of projects that have been underway for some time, probably the Sydney Metro project, looking at some of the key benefits there. What we've seen is a large group of long-term unemployed people go through pre-employment training and secure roles on that project, and now they have a rewarding career that goes beyond the span of that particular project. So I guess from a New South Wales perspective, it's looking at benefit of the community in general in terms of less reliance on the support services that government typically supplies. So from a government perspective, I would see that's probably one of the key benefits that we see.
Fantastic. So less reliance on support services and improving prospects for the long-term unemployed. It's great. Jackie?
Some of the outcomes have been quality improvement, innovation, and I think when you start for ethical procurement, when you start drilling down through the supply chain, because you've got the obligation to understand your supply chain, sort of an outcome of that is you start to understand it, and with that you start challenging and questioning. So I think some of the outcomes has been innovation. I think we've also seen innovation through just diversifying our supply chain has come about. I think one of the outcomes is that minority groups and sort of the social sort of local communities can be very competitive. So whilst we struggle and it's a challenge to ensure that we've got competitiveness, it's actually an outcome which has been a really nice result. I think it is about removing some unconscious bias as well through driving that. So,
excellent. So we've heard from Richard about social outcomes like reducing long-term unemployment and economic outcomes like less reliance on support services by government. We've heard about business outcomes from Jackie in terms of quality improvement and innovation and improved competitiveness. Can you top that, Ross? What are the outcomes?
Just show me the money. So I think I use an example. So the steel industry is a highly cost, is a very high cost-based industry. So focusing on energy use, water use, all of these things is naturally something we've done for many, many years anyway. It's just good business practice. It's been less so implied down our supply chain. So, for example, the Australian Steel Institute has a sustainability charter that's been in place for a few years, and some of us from RM and BlueScope were instrumental in getting that implemented in Australia as sort of a early test case in how to apply sustainability principles in the fabrication industry. And a lot of the pushback from that was it's going to cost me money, I'm going to put extra resources into it. Well, what's occurred and what has been shown in a number of case studies from the awards that are run every 2 years by the ASI is that it's actually saved significant money in those industries. So they've applied, energy saving, water saving, and other approaches from their sustainability charter, and have actually that's turned out to be a positive, and not just a short-term positive for the one project they might have been trying to get their certification for, but a long-term advantage for them in terms of sustainability. So I think that's an example of where everyone seems to think that it will cost money when you go downstream. It doesn't actually have to at all. In fact, it can be quite a positive.
So cost savings, reducing costs, and you've also mentioned environmental improvement.
Yeah.
So excellent. And Nicole, what about the experience of the GBCA outcomes?
So ours are very much focused on environmental improvements at the moment. Maybe just two really quick case studies. So just across the water here, Lend-Lease with Barangaroo mandated that their tenants needed to get Green Star certified fit-outs. So we had roughly 80 little retailers who all of a sudden all had to learn about Green Star and how to do that stuff, which if I was one of them, I'd probably be frightened. But they've really taken that on, and we've seen a swathe of them getting certified, which is wonderful. And now we've got this industry that's developing skills to understand and actually have these sort of outcomes. On the other side of the country in Perth, the BHP Billiton development over there, Brookfield Place I think it is, they had 17,000 pieces of furniture that they needed for that development. That's just staggering. So in order for that to be certified, they actually took on educating the industry on how to build certifiable furniture. So all of a sudden, like if it's only 1 or 2 bits of furniture, people go, I couldn't be bothered. But when you can have a piece of 17,000 pieces of furniture, it's worth changing your business practices for. And so it's wonderful to be able to see that you get that sort of impact from companies choosing to take on Green Star certification.
So to summarise the beneficial outcomes of a better approach to sustainable procurement, just in 5 minutes, we've got social benefits related to employment, economic benefits related to less reliance on government services, quality improvements, innovation and reduced costs for business, environmental improvements, and skills development across an entire industry. Have we established the business case for sustainable and ethical procurement? I think if you have not got that message now, you need to head for the pub because you're wasting your time here. The message is lost. In case you do want more, and there is always more, please look out for the paper called Creating Social Value Through Strategic Infrastructure Procurement, which will be released by ISCA in the post-conference materials. Will you please join me in thanking our fantastic panellists?